Well, I know of some people who lived through the Great Depression. And it had, during the Great Depression, they had very little, and they didn't know what would happen to them. I mean, would there be food tomorrow, or even today? And if my clothes wore out, what would I have to wear? Would I be able to get anything new? And out of that experience, some of them picked up some new habits. And some of these habits were simple, and understandable, like always having a full pantry, because they never wanted to think, I might not have food tomorrow. Or always having plenty of toilet paper. You just wanted those things on hand. But then there are some interesting habits that some people picked up. I knew someone who would save and reuse their paper towels. And so I remember walking into their kitchen, and spread all over the kitchen were paper towels laying out, drying, because they were reusing them. Some people who lived through the Great Depression, though, gained a great perspective on life. They gained the perspective to be thankful for everything they have. But others became hoarders. They feel the need to get everything you can and then hold on to everything you can as well. And these people who have this issue, they have a fear, even if it's subconscious. But they have a fear they're going to run out. They're not going to have what they need. And some of them even become greedy. But you know what? You don't have to go through the Great Depression to become that way. People have natural tendencies to worry and fret. We have natural tendencies to be selfish and to hold on tightly to possessions. But faith shifts our perspective. Faith in God allows us to live differently. And we see this in Abraham. So first, today, we will see that faith frees us to be generous. So we begin today in chapter 13 and verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev, which is the southern part of Israel, the wilderness area on the south of Israel. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. So Abraham returns from Egypt. If you remember, why did he go down to Egypt? Because there was a famine in the land, up in the land of Canaan, where God had told him to go to. And when he decided, hey, there's not enough here, I need to go down there. And he went. And he had this little lapse of faith. And when he went, he also told his wife, tell everyone you're my sister, not my wife, in order to protect him. And we talked about this last week, and we saw that eventually he got kicked out of town, or out of the country, out of Egypt. But see, when that was all happening and Sarah got taken, God intervened in the situation, and he protected them because God is faithful. And so after all of that, after they got kicked out of town, he left town in shame, and now he's back in the land. Abraham's back, but not only back in the land, he seems to be more back on track spiritually. And notice where he went and what he did. Back in verse 4, let's read that again. Verse 4 says, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. So he went to the place where he had built the altar. Why? He went there and worshiped. Okay? And so he is back and he's worshiped God. And then this section here in chapter 13, it ends with a very similar note. Look at verse 18. It says, so Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So these two statements here, one at the beginning and one at the end, they kind of bookmark this section, and it makes it clear that after his failure down in Egypt, Abram is back where he's supposed to be and worshiping God. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes we fail. And sometimes when we fail, we have a tendency to stay away, to keep God at a distance. Maybe it's because we feel guilt, or maybe we feel unworthy, or maybe we're holding on to sin and we don't really want to let go of it yet. And so we're allowing that sin to keep God at a distance. But we can take a lesson here from Abraham. When we fail, get back up and get to worshiping God and fellowship with God. Get back to where God has called you. This is where you belong. This is where God wants you. And so wherever life takes you, wherever your choices have taken you, remember, God is merciful, and God is gracious and kind, and he forgives, and there is no reason to stay away, to keep him at a distance. Let's continue reading. Verse 5. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Okay, so there's a problem now. God has blessed both Abram and Lot. And you might ask, how is that a problem? Well, it's not really. However, now, because they have been blessed, there's now, between the two of them, they have too much stuff. Too much stuff for one place, too many animals to care for in one little area. And so they have to do something. Now notice that it's also pointed out here that the Canaanites and the Perizzites are living in the land too. And if you remember, Abram doesn't own any land. He is just living there. So he's an outsider, a foreigner who's just living in the land. He's a traveling nomad there in the land. And so the permanent residents, they own the land. And not only that, they will have taken the best of the land. So they own the best grazing land, the best of all the land. And then Abraham and Lot, they're just using whatever is left over. So it's probably not the best land there. Probably doesn't have a whole lot of great pasture land just left over for them. But they're having to share whatever is left over. Whatever is left open, the less desirable spaces. So it appears there's a shortage of pasture and water for the animals. And their workers who are caring for the animals, they start getting in each other's ways and they start competing for resources. So Abram's going to step in. Look at verse 8. So then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen, we're relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So Abram recognizes what's happening, and he says to Lot, he says, we're family. We shouldn't be fighting. We shouldn't have contention between us. We're family. And so he offers a solution. He says it's better for us to put some space between us and have peace. So there's a lot of land. So choose whichever part of the land you want, and I'll go the other direction. Now, here's the thing. Abram is the uncle. And God made the promise to Abram. So why does he give Lot the first choice? And I think that's our natural way to think, right? We would say, well, Abram should have that. And it's amazing how many families fight when there's a will read, right? I mean, why do we fight over stuff? But anyways, Abram says we shouldn't be fighting over stuff. But Abram could have pulled rank here to make sure that he got the better land. But he doesn't. Why? Because he's not worried. He's operating in faith. He knows that his well-being and his prosperity isn't dependent on the quality of the land that he has. What's it dependent on? God. Because God has made him a promise. And so he's trusting God. But then Lot, he looks at things differently. He doesn't choose by faith, he chooses by sight, by what he sees, what looks good. He looks and says, well, that's the best. He has a very natural human perspective. Well, I need the good land. The better the land, the better off I will be. Even if it hurts his uncle. And so he chooses the best land for himself. You could say he's a little greedy, a little selfish, and he takes advantage of Abram's generosity. He's not operating in faith, but from a worldly perspective. He's not trusting in God. Also notice the statements made in verses 10 and 13. Verse 10, at the end there, after he says that he looked up and saw that the land was good, it says, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. A little parenthetical remark for us to clue us in on what's going on here. And then in verse 13, he says, now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Now we're given that remark right after we're told that he moved very close to Sodom. See, the area that he is choosing is near Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah is in that river valley. And we know Sodom and Gomorrah is known as the epitome of sin and wickedness, as people who are opposed to God. And where did Lot pitch his tent? Tells us in verse 12. He moved his tent as far as Sodom. This is telling us something about what's going on in Lot's life. He's telling us that Lot is making poor life choices. He is being driven by selfishness rather than faith. And he is heading down toward the worldly and sinful rather being drawn to God. On the other hand, we have Abram. Abram is trusting God, and God continues to bless him. God tells him, look at all of the land in every direction. Look, everything you see. Now, this would include the land where Abram is settled at that point. It would include the land that is just okay to support his animals, but it would also include the best of the land, even the land of the Jordan Valley. But he says, look at everything. And he says, all of this in every direction will one day be yours. It will belong to Abram's descendants. And God will give it to them. And God also tells Abram that he will cause Abram to have many descendants. In fact, an uncountable number of descendants. He says they will be like the dust of the earth. And so it's impossible to count every speck of dust on the earth, right? I mean, it would be impossible to count the specks of dust on this podium. In other words, he will have many, many, many descendants. Well, then God tells Abram to get up and walk the land. Now, this is an interesting thing because in the ancient Near East, kings would tour their kingdoms. They would go out and tour around the land, walk their land to see all that they owned. It's kind of like that, what Abram's doing here. Basically, Abram is to tour his land and claim it because God has given it to him, to his family. And so Abram moves around, and then he ends up settling, and he worships. Now, there's a few applications for us here. First of all, what brought on the problem between Abram and Lot? It was God's great blessing. Now, that didn't cause the problem, but that's what provided the opportunity for the problem, right? But see, when God blesses his people with more, it brings more responsibility. It brings more to have to take care of. If God blesses you with a new job or a promotion, you've got more responsibility. If God blesses you with kids, you've got a huge responsibility. If God blesses you with money, well, now you are responsible to be a good steward of that money that God has blessed you with. And if God blesses a church with new ministries or with opportunities or with growth, well, then there's new needs and new, you need more teaching and more discipleship, and there's a potential for strife in the body. The thing is any blessing may bring new responsibilities, new needs, and the potential for problems. Even when God is blessing you, we must guard against selfishness and live by faith. A second application, in our world, we always think that the grass is always greener, just over the next hill. Oh, if I just get there, the grass is greener. We're always looking to better our situation. And we think, well, I need more. And if I can just find that perfect place, or if I can make this one change this one thing in my life, then I'll be successful. Then I will be fulfilled. Then I will be happy. And sometimes we will even move away from God in our pursuit of having more or having something better But in reality, it's only by faith in God that we will be truly fulfilled and happy and content. And one other application here. Faith frees us to be generous. Abram didn't demand, I need the best land. Lot, you go find something else. Abram trusted God to provide, and he was generous. He didn't worry about giving away what was best or the best of the land. He knew God, and he knew God's promise, and he knew that God was generous, and therefore Abram was able to be generous. What stops us from being generous? Is it a lack of stuff or a lack of faith? When we trust in God, we don't need to hold so tightly to things, but we can give. And by faith, we know God will provide, and we are free to be generous with what God has blessed us with. Well, now at this point in the story takes a turn for the worse. But we'll see that faith allows us to face the impossible. We're going to be in chapter 14 for you. Let me just summarize the first 9 verses of chapter 14 for you. Those 9 verses tell us that there are 5 kings in the area near the Jordan River, where the area where Sodom and Gomorrah are. Okay, so these 5 kings were in the area where Lot is living. These 5 kings would include the kings of Sodom and the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. So these 5 kings, they had been paying tribute to a greater king from up north. And they'd been paying this tribute for 12 years, which means that every year they would have to give him stuff. Whether it was money, gold, silver, crops, whatever it is, whatever he demanded, they had to pay it. They've been doing it for 12 years, and they don't want to do it anymore. And so they team up, these 5 teams team up together to oppose him, the greater king up north. And so to try and tell him no. Well, that king up north doesn't like this. And so he, along with 3 other kings, he gets 3 other kings to join him, and they come down to face those 5 kings in battle. And so on the way down, as they're coming from the north, on their way down, what do? Those 4 kings conquer everyone else in their path. And so they're just taking more and more stuff. They're just beating everyone along the way. And when they get down there near the Dead Sea, they fight with these 5 kings. And so the army of the 4 kings from the north defeat the armies of the 5 kings from the Jordan River Valley. And then the 5 kings, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and what is left of their armies, run away. They just run to the hills and hide. This is where we're going to pick it up. Verse 10. Chapter 14, verse 10. Now, the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits or tar pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So the 4 kings from the north take all the stuff that belonged to the defeated people from the south, including Lot and all of his stuff. And he's got a lot, right? And we heard about that already. And so they took Lot and all of his stuff. But notice one other thing. Where is Lot living at this time? He's not just pitching his tent by Sodom, near Sodom, as far as Sodom. He is in Sodom. Okay? We could easily read over that, but it's there. And we're told that he is now living in Sodom. He has continued to move away from God towards worldliness. Now, we don't want to go the way of Lot. So he's kind of like a cautionary tale for us here. We don't want to go the way of Lot. But there is always the danger of becoming desensitized to the sin around us. I mean, first, we become used to it. Well, it just happens all around us, and we get kind of, okay, that's just normal. And then we come to a place where we're okay with it. And then we move right into the middle of it. It's a gradual drift, but it's a drift into sin and out of fellowship with God. And the consequences of getting close to sin rather than God can be tragic. Let's keep reading, verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman, his relative, had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. That's up in Syria. Then he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. And so when Abram hears what has happened, in spite of Lot's failures, Abram is faithful to Lot. Now this reminds me of God. God is faithful, God's character. God is faithful. Even when we sin, God is faithful. And so, but Abram's men and the men of these three Amorite brothers, they take off to chase down those the four kings from the north. And so Abram and these three men we're told about here, they had a treaty. These are three Amorite brothers, and they have a treaty with Abram. Probably they recognized how God was blessing Abram, and they said, hey, let's make a treaty. You know, the whole God said, I will bless those who bless you. And so they're treating Abraham well, and Abraham is in this treaty with him. But anyways, they all get together and they take off to the north, chasing down the armies of the four kings. And they follow those four kings all the way up to Dan, which is the farthest north point of Israel. And when they find them, they attack them at night. And they win the battle. Abram and the three brothers win the battle. And so they defeat those four kings, and they take back all of the people and all of the stuff, including Lot. Now, this is amazing, because Abraham went out against impossible odds. I mean, these kings were doing what? They were coming down. They already were in control of the area and making people pay tribute. Then they came down and they defeated everyone else on their way. And then when they fought against those five kings, they defeated them. And then on their way home, Abraham goes up there and beats them. This is incredible that he's able to do this. It's not like a king's army. It's just the 300 and whatever men and the brothers' men. It's men who grew up in Abraham's house and just been trained. But they go up and they fight against these four strong kings who had defeated the five kings and everyone else in their path. But Abram goes up there and beats them. This was a huge risk for Abram to take. It was dangerous. He could lose everything. But he jumps into action. What would cause him to do that? Well, he trusts God. And he knows that nothing is impossible with God. When we live by faith, we can face seemingly impossible situations because we know that God is bigger than any situation. and we know that he is with us. Now, after the battle, Abram is met by two very different kings. One is righteous, and the other is not. And we'll see that faith gives us a right perspective on possessions. So look chapter 14, beginning in verse 17. After his return, Abram's return, from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, he was the king from the north, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, Abram, at the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." And so these two kings that meet Abram, the first is godly. His name is Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness. And he is the king of Salem, or Jerusalem, but the king of Salem, which also means king of peace. And he's also a priest of the Most High. In other words, a priest of the one true God, the same God that Abram worships. And Melchizedek comes out, and we're told that he feeds Abram. Literally, it says that he gave him bread and wine, but this refers to a whole meal. Again, it's one of those things like you would say from A to Z. It's just bread and wine. He gave them a meal. All right, and so this is basically a banquet in honor of Abraham's victory. And by the way, notice also that that Melchizedek is generous, like Abram is. But then Melchizedek blesses Abram. He really says how God has blessed Abram in his blessing, but he pronounces this blessing. And in this, we see that Melchizedek is God's representative of blessing here. And in the blessing, we hear that this victory was really from God. That's how Abram was able to win, is that God gave them into his hands. And so God, in this blessing, we see that, and here the victory was from God, but God owns everything. God is sovereign over everything, and he has handed the enemy over to Abram. Then Abram gives Melchizedek a tithe, or a tenth of all the plunder. Now, it was customary to give priests a tithe. But by doing this, we see that Abram recognizes Melchizedek as greater than himself, and recognizes Melchizedek as his spiritual superior. And this later becomes an important theological point to show that Jesus is greater than the priests of the Old Testament law. He comes from the order of Melchizedek, that he is greater than the priests of the Old Covenant, and that Jesus is an everlasting priest. And you can find all that in the book of Hebrews. So even though this is all we know of Melchizedek, he is an important figure. Then there's the other king, the king of Sodom. He's ungrateful and demanding. He goes to Abraham and he tells him what to do. He says, give me the people and you can keep this stuff. Now, we may read that, and on one hand, it may seem that he's being generous. He says, oh, you can have all this stuff. But in reality, he has no right to tell Abram, you can keep it or give me anything. He has no right to say anything to him, to try and set the terms. Abram was the victor here. The king of Sodom had been defeated. He's the loser. He had no right to say anything, no right to claim anything. But he tries to set the terms. So Abram picks up on this king's wrong attitude. And he understands that this king is self-serving. And he understands that this king may try to hold it over Abram's head if he takes any of their stuff. That he may come back later and say, well, Abram took advantage of us. Abram is rich because of us. So Abram picks up on this, and now he sets the terms. And Abram says that he will take nothing for himself. He had a right to, but he won't do it. He doesn't do it. He says that he made a vow, and he says he raised his hand to God. He's saying he made a vow to God not to take anything. So this king can't say anything about enriching Abram, or that he was the one that made him rich, or he helped him, or that Abram took advantage of them, or anything. But Abram makes it clear that everything he has is from God. But Abraham, the second part of the terms is that the other men who went with him, the three brothers, that they would be fairly compensated for risking their lives and for saving the people. So he says, everyone else, the men who have eaten, they get, and then you divide up, the other men can take their share. Well, now, ironically, the king of Salem is like most people. Most people, demanding and entitled. I deserve this. Give it to me. On the other hand, Abraham and Melchizedek are generous. They're giving, and they live by faith. They had a different perspective. You see, they know God, and they know, and what did they call God? When they talked about him, they called him the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. In other words, the God who owns everything. That's their perspective. They know that God owns everything. And knowing this makes all the difference. It's all his. So everything belongs to him. And the Bible makes it clear that everything we have is a gift from him. And we are stewards of his wealth. And by faith, we understand this. By faith, we recognize that it's all his. In fact, we ourselves are his. We belong to him. And everything we have is his. And so he has blessed us. He has provided, and he will provide. Faith changes things. Faith shifts our perspective. Worry is replaced by trust. When situations look impossible, we know that it's not impossible for God. And we can hold things and wealth loosely, knowing that it really belongs to God. And so if he wants to use it, he can use it. And we can be generous, knowing that he owns everything. And he keeps his promises. And he will care for us. The faith perspective is very different from our natural, worldly perspective. By faith, we know that God has blessed us. And we have a lot to be thankful for. And we know that everything we have is from him. And so we also know that what we do with our possessions and how we manage our money is a matter of faith. So live by faith and glorify God with all that you have and by how you use all that he has blessed you with.